Hello, welcome to the episode of the Let People Prosper series. My name is Dr. Vance Ginn. Welcome to the Let People Prosper show. Well, we've had some discussions recently about the economy, about the budget, about inflation. Today, we're going to dive even deeper into what's going on with the federal budget, the massive national debt that we have, a lot of the excessive spending and other sort of things that have been going on over the last several years, really decades now. And who better to have on the program than Brian Riedl? He will be our guest today. Brian, welcome to the Let People Prosper show.
Thanks, Vance. Glad to be here.
Well, it's good to have you on the program. We're going to have a good discussion today about the federal budget and a lot of other issues. I'm sure they'll come up. But let me first start by giving the audience your bio. So Brian Riedl is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, focusing on budget, tax, and economic policy. Previously, he worked for 6 years as chief economist for Senator Rob Portman out of Ohio, Republican out of Ohio, and as staff director of the Senate Finance Subcommittee on Fiscal Responsibility and Economic Growth. He also served as a director of budget and spending policy for Marco Rubio's presidential campaign and was the lead architect of the 10-year deficit reduction plan for Mitt Romney's presidential campaign. During 2001 to 2011, Riedl served as the Heritage Foundation's lead research fellow on federal budget and spending policy. In that position, he helped lay the groundwork for Congress to cap soaring federal spending, rein in farm subsidies, and ban pork barrel earmarks. Yes, we need more of that. Riedl's writing and research have been featured in, among others, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, and the National Review. He's a frequent guest on NBC, CBS, PBS, CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and C-SPAN, all over the place. Riedl holds a bachelor's degree in economics and political science from the University of Wisconsin and a master's degree in public affairs from Princeton University. Brian, again, welcome to the Let People Prosper show.
Thank you. I'm sorry my bio was long. You could feel free to stop anytime and say he's the budget guy.
Yeah. Well, this is true. And we've got to know each other for a while now on Twitter, of all places, back and forth, and a couple of other virtual seminars. We haven't, I don't think yet met in person, but hopefully soon that will happen. So it's great to have you on today. First thing I like to do is with every guest is to get them to talk a little bit about what motivates them. You've been working in this space for a long time. What motivates you to get up every morning and say, you know what, today's going to be a good day. I'm going to fight for the budget. What really motivates Brian?
I'm motivated because I think we're in deep trouble as a country, and I'm trying to save things. I came to Washington in 2001 to work on federal spending deficits. And things have gotten a lot worse, which means, I'm probably not very effective at what I do. But I take a look at our fiscal situation, and it is so dire long term. And the deficits are going to get so big that if we don't do something about this, there's going to be a significant crash, and we're going to come out the other side in real economic trouble with really high taxes, drastic benefit cuts, or rampant inflation. So I wake up in the morning and stand athwart federal spenders yelling, stop,
yes,
trying to avert a crisis.
Yeah. No, that's wonderful. We need more people to do that because you're right. I mean, we're running into what I think is a fiscal crisis. National debt over $31 trillion. Just the net interest on the debt continues to mount at a rapid rate, and interest rates continue to go up. Yep. So we're going to see a lot of that. And I want to dig into more of that as we go through this discussion. What has been some of the key highlights of your background that you'd want the audience to know that got you to where you are today, that helped you to build your worldview of the way you see, the way you see the budget and other things?
My world, like in terms of
with the budget and the fiscal worldview and maybe some other issues. You talked a little bit about when you were at Heritage before the program. What are some of those things that kind of got you to where you are today?
Well, I think I originally got interested in budget policy because I wanted to learn what government does. And the easiest way to learn about what government does is to take a look at how they spend their money. And so I got really interested because I actually kind of thought of it as a way to decide, what do you think the role of government should be? If you think if we should be doing the more defense, more education, more entitlements, higher taxes, the budget is where you play out what do you want government to be and do. It's where you play out the big picture issues. And so that's what originally got me focused on federal spending and spent. But then again, like in the time that I've worked on it, you work on it more and more, you dive into the numbers deeper and deeper, and you go, oh my goodness, we're in trouble. Over the next 30 years, the budget deficit is projected to be $114 trillion over the next 30 years. And that's the baseline rosy scenario before we've done any more damage. that makes you motivated to work on this issue. You take a look at deficits going to $2-3 trillion a year over the next decade under peace and prosperity. And then you look across the ocean to Europe and you see the huge taxes they pay in Europe. And you say, if we don't do something about this, we are going to be Europe. If we don't do something about this, your payroll taxes are going to double from 15 to 30%. Or we're going to be looking at a value-added tax, basically a national sales tax of 20 or 25%. You're going to see a lot less prosperity, not just for our kids, but even for ourselves before even we retire, because this is coming up quickly. And so that's where I'm coming from.
Yeah, well, and that makes a lot of sense, and I'm glad you've been doing that for so long. What were some of your memories from the Heritage Foundation? You were there for about a decade. What were some exciting things you had there?
I was at Heritage. It was a more of a different Heritage than you see today. It was less political. There wasn't Heritage Action. There wasn't as much lobbying. It was more of a traditional think tank back then. Great group of people. The way I kind of made my mark at Heritage was I got hired at age 26 to run federal budget policy at Heritage. First job in Washington. I'm at a conservative think tank, and I start doing my research, and oh my goodness, we have a new Republican president, Bush, who's spending like a drunken sailor. And not just on 9/11 either, but domestically, we have a new Republican president spending like a drunken sailor. So I put out reports that say our new Republican president is spending way too much money. And that got some attention. The Heritage Foundation was not known back then for criticizing new Republican presidents very loudly. And so I did report after report after report running the numbers and saying, we're in trouble here. Spending is rising, deficits are rising. This is a problem. I ended up getting banned from the Bush White House. I was told that I was never allowed in the Bush White House ever again. I would get yelled at by the Bush White House. And of course, liberal reporters loved me because all of a sudden, they could say, even the Heritage Foundation is criticizing President Bush. They kind of used me politically in that way. But that was kind of what I became known for. Paul Krugman, who's my former professor, by the way, at Princeton. Wrote an article in 2006 calling me the top conservative critic of Bush's spending. And of course, he said it as an insult because he liked the spending. But that was my fun at Heritage. I kind of came in as a 26-year-old nobody, and I ended up making some enemies. But I wasn't trying to make enemies. I was trying to go where the data went. My view was, I am going to criticize bad policy wherever it comes from, and I'm going to compliment good policy wherever it comes from, and I'm not going to bite my tongue just because it's a Republican president. But it was a fun 10 years at Heritage. But boy, did I make some enemies.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I bet those were some interesting conversations that you had with the White House and everything else that was going on. Could be a fly in the room whenever that was happening. There was also some interesting times that you had with Senator Portman and also Marco Rubio and Mitt Romney. What were some of those experiences like?
It was good. Mitt Romney was really fun. The first time I met him, I walked into a room in a hotel to sit down and brief him on budget. And he picks up his phone and he starts reading me his saved list of the funniest names he sees in newspaper articles. He keeps a list on his phone of the funniest names he reads in newspaper articles. And I just thought, this is a different kind of politician that I'm used to. There's a certain, kind of silliness and almost innocence to him. There wasn't the cynicism that you usually get. I had worked with a lot of senators and governors and congressmen. There were a lot of gruff and very serious and intimidating. And there's Mitt Romney just laughing like a child, reading a list of funny names to me. But the 2012 campaign was great. Mitt Romney's a great guy. You can agree or disagree on his policies. You can have whatever opinion on his policies, but he was probably the nicest, most pure person I worked for. And the Rubio campaign in 2016 was a positive experience too. The good thing about Romney and Rubio both is they were very open-minded. They didn't come in with talking points and say, fit policy to match my talking points. They would sit down and say, okay, what's the situation and what's the right policy? And I really appreciated that. When I worked for Senator Portman, it was the same thing. Sometimes I would sit down with Senator Portman and I'd put on my political hat. And I would say, I understand politically this might be dangerous, and I understand. And he'd say, spare me the politics. I don't care. You're the economist. Just tell me what the right policy is. I'll worry about the politics. And those are the politicians you like to work for. The ones where
Yeah.
you actually can dive into the issues, and they're not just looking at poll data. They're going, leave the politics to the political advisors. Tell me what the right policy is. Those are the good guys.
Yeah, well, that's right. I'm sure those were wonderful conversations and trying to see what all the different things. And you brought up some good ideas along the way. I'm glad that you were there doing that at the time. And, whenever you're thinking about it from an economic perspective, who are some of your favorite economists?
Milton Friedman. I have to always start with St. Milton of Chicago, like every good conservative economist. I was heavily influenced by Milton Friedman, F.A. Hayek. I read Henry Hazlitt Economics in one lesson when I was in college, and I still reached that book today, and I'm surprised at how many economists with really impressive credentials still miss the basic lessons in economics in one lesson. Thomas Sowell is a terrific economist. I'm trying to look back on my bookshelf.
Right. Yeah. No, that's already a great group right there.
Yeah, their books are right there. Even today, Greg Mank. I work with Glenn Hubbard a lot, Cass.
Okay.
A lot. Great group. What about you? Who are your favorites?
Well, I think number one would be Milton Friedman. I can't tell. I probably read Capitalism and Freedom at least 4 times and Free to Choose a number of times. I still watch his YouTube presentations, his speeches, because you learn something new each time. Frederick Hayek is another one. Road to Serfdom. The Fatal Conceit is probably my favorite book, though. Right? Knowledge and Decisions by Thomas Sowell is one of my favorites as well. So no, I'm right there with you on a lot of those. Those are great ones. Henry Hazlitt, the Economics in One Lesson. If someone asks me, family member or friend asks me, what's the one economics book I should read? That's usually the one I tell them, because he was an economist, right? He was a journalist that was writing and it was able to explain things in a way that the non-economist could understand and put it into practical terms. I think that was one of the great things about Henry Hazlitt.
He was great. He was right, which is great for a journalist. And he could, as you say, he could explain it in ways regular people could understand without the jargon, without having to do 6 graphs.
Yeah.
And it was, I found him so intuitive. And like I said, there's brilliant economists with really impressive credentials who still get basic economics wrong because they forget some of the basic lessons from economics in one lesson. Mm-hmm.
Yep. No, I think that's right. And I think we've seen that a lot in this most recent period, with the inflationary story. There was a lot of talk early on how it was going to be transitory inflation, that this was all going to go away quickly. It was going to go up and then go away. And even some of my good friends that are, good conservative, libertarian types of economists, classical liberal is what I consider myself. They were like, look, it's going to go away. I think they were looking so much at the supply side effects and the effects of the pandemic that was creating a situation that once those supply chains weren't disrupted anymore and were free flowing, that those prices would come back down. But they overlooked kind of what Milton Friedman said, where inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. Now, you got to look at the supply side as well, but there was so much money that was put into the economy in a short period of time, at the same time that the supply side was being choked by so much regulation and everything else, that it was, in my view, is always going to be longer term. How did you kind of see some of that situation?
I saw the same thing. I mean, inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. The Federal Reserve pumped in about $4 to $5 trillion of new dollars into the economy. At the same time, that supply constraints meant that you had more money chasing fewer goods. People were slow coming back to work. They weren't allowed to come back to work for a long time. You had trade blockages, the ports. You had productivity slowly coming back. Capital investment slow to come back. So you literally you injected all this money at the same time that the number of goods started and services, to be honest, both started drying up. So of course you're going to get inflation. And I was amazed at how tone deaf the policies have been. A $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan, major new tariffs from China, Buy America rules, raising procurement costs, all sorts of tightening of Davis-Bacon, raising government construction costs, new ethanol mandates, raising costs for food. You had all of these policies at the same time that you already were going to get some inflation coming out of the recession. And so I think, some inflation was inevitable. And that's what we've seen globally. The Federal Reserve, the things we had to do during the pandemic meant that some degree of inflation was inevitable. But it was economic malpractice for Washington to then pour gasoline on the fire by going on a major spending spree, tariffs, business regulations, building limitations, construction limitations, procurement regulations, oil and gas limitations, all raising costs at the exact same time. It's really amazing how much worse they made it.
Yeah, it really is. And a lot of it can be explained by just basic economics. Getting to your point earlier, we need to just learn basic economics again. Because you're exactly right. Chasing too much money, chasing too few goods, you're going to get higher inflation. And so, and I want to get back to that here in a minute. I want to kind of get into some of your thoughts about what was going on during the Trump administration. I was there for a little while, for about a year, from June 2019 to May of 2020 as chief economist of the Office of Management and Budget, which is kind of interesting because, the first person who had that position was Art Laffer in 1971 when they changed it from the budget of the Bureau to OMB. And then in 1981 was Larry Kudlow. Yeah. And so I happened to be there in 2020. And so we had some good discussions about that with Larry Kudlow. But I know that, look, there were some good pro-growth things that I think the administration did with deregulation, a lot of things with the tax cuts. Part of that was before I was there. And I know within the last budget that we wrote, and I was there during that time, we found $4.6 trillion in savings, tried to find a way out of this fiscal crisis. And of course, that was before the pandemic and everything else started. But I know that you had also been kind of critical of some of the spending and everything else that had been going on. What were some of your concerns about what was going on during that period?
Yeah, my concern is I think it was a missed opportunity on spending and deficits. I like the tax cuts. I think the tax cuts were a good policy, particularly on the corporate side. We had a completely unsustainable, archaic, global outlier corporate policy, and we were bleeding jobs and investment. But I do wish the tax cuts had been paid for more. I think that we could have done more to broaden the tax base to pay for a lot of what we did on taxes. On the spending side, not only did we really not get much done on Social Security and Medicare and the big entitlements, even when Republicans had a trifecta, that was the time where Republicans needed to be more aggressive on spending, and we weren't. But then we had the big budget deals on discretionary spending, where we basically repealed the BCA caps and allowed discretionary spending to grow really rapidly. So, even if you like some of the policies, the tax cuts had a lot of great policies. Some of you can point to some of the discretionary hikes that were positive in certain areas. Boy, we just, during peace and prosperity through 2019, we were still pushing up deficits when we needed to be reforming entitlements. I don't really begrudge the administration with the pandemic costs. And I think one of the problems I have with Democratic critiques is they say, Trump added X trillion to deficits. That's true, but some of that was about half of his deficits were the pandemic. Now the Democrats wrote those bills, passed those bills out of Congress, and championed the benefits, such as the child credit, PPP loan. So I think it's really disingenuous for Democrats to push through a lot of the spending and then complain about it. As a matter of fact, I'll plug. I wrote earlier last year the definitive report on the Trump budget record. And in the past, I wrote the definitive report on the Obama budget record, the definitive report on the Bush budget record, where I literally went through every line item of every bill and every movement to the deficit. And President Trump's legislation did add $7.8 trillion to 10-year deficits. But when Democrats complain about that, Democrats voted for 6.5 trillion of the 7.8. 80% of it was bipartisan. So I'm critical, and half of the 7.8 trillion was the pandemic that I don't think you can really blame anyone on for that spending. But I am more critical of the other half of the spending and the other half of the deficits. But I'm also a little annoyed when Democrats take credit for all these policies and then say, but those are Trump's deficits. You can't have it both ways.
Right. Yeah. And that's a great point, Brian. It's one of the things whenever I see some of these charts that you'll break it down, like here's the national debt, how much it increased by over time, and it's broken down by president. It's like, okay, but who is in Congress? Congress
exactly.
ultimately has the power of the purse, right? And so the Congress is also the one that's passing all these bills. I mean, the president does write a budget, which I'm not so sure has much influence other than saying these are the priorities of the president. But it was good to write it and see what's in it, and everything like that. But at the end of the day, the Congress votes and they pass out the budget. Then it's a question of whether or not the president is going to veto a budget. And there's not line item authority like there is like in Texas where I live. Greg Abbott has line item authority. And so it's either do you pass a budget and try to get some things that you like, or do you veto it and say, you know what, go back to the drawing board. It's a big decision to make.
Yeah, it's even worse than that because I first off, when you become president, you inherit a baseline. And the baseline is the government's on autopilot. What's it going to look like over the next 10 years? When Trump got elected, he inherited a baseline of $10 trillion in deficits over the next decade. That was the default that he inherited before he even started. Beyond that, 70% of all spending is on autopilot. The entitlement programs, the president does not have the unilateral authority to change. Congress has to pass a bill. It's on autopilot. And about 95% of revenues are on autopilot. For the remaining portion that's not on autopilot, as you mentioned, Congress has to pass the bill first, and then you have to take or leave the whole thing.
Right.
So the president has damn near no power over the federal budget, except in the rare instance when the president can persuade Congress to pass a bill that he really wants and then signs it. That is essentially the only thing the president really has power over. The rest of the budget is either on autopilot or it's basically passed by Congress and the president has to take it or leave it. So, I think, and I've written reports on this, the worst way to judge a president's deficit record is by looking at the deficit during his presidency. And I know that sounds ironic. And that's why, like, when I wrote the report on the Trump budget record, I split up what's the baseline, what was on autopilot, what was legislation. You have to break up what the president can control. And even then, I also did sections on what was the president's budget proposal, what was the president's vision, because again, the president has to take what Congress gives him. And if you don't break that out, you're doing lazy and misleading analysis.
Yeah. Well, that's fascinating, Brian. I didn't know about this. And is that all available online?
Yes. If you just Google Manhattan Institute Trump budget record.
Okay.
Trump fiscal record.
And for the audience, I'll add it to the show notes page, advanceagain.substack.com. I'll put that all on the website. So that'll be good. I can't wait to look at that.
You can Google Obama fiscal record too. And actually, one of the neat things about this report and also my chart book that came out is there's actually a section then that compares Bush, Obama, and Trump using the same statistical methodology. You can do full comparisons across presidents and see how they did compared to each other. It's all methodologically consistent. There's no bias. There's no games. It's all the same methodology to compare presidents.
And so, what were the results? What did you find when you did that?
I found Trump scored the highest on legislation, 7.8 trillion over 10 years. Obama was
so scoring highest in the sense that there was the most debt added.
Trump added 7.8 trillion over 10 years. Looking at my numbers right now, Obama added 5 trillion over 10 years, over a 10-year period, and Bush added 7 trillion over a 10-year period. And if you just measure by legislation. Now, from the numbers, you have to go into what's driving it. And again, that's the factors that are up to the viewer or up to the reader. Like Trump had 7.8 trillion, but half of that was the pandemic. Bush had 6.9 trillion, but 2.5 trillion of that was 9/11 costs. And so that's where I still gave the numbers and I gave the breakdown, and the reader gets to decide, this was justified, this was not justified. What I just do is I provide the breakdown, and then people can say, okay, this president should have done better. This president did the best he could under the economic conditions, but those are the numbers.
Yeah, no, that really is fascinating. I guess for Obama, one could argue that it was partially from the Great Recession, right?
Correct. President Obama there was $1 trillion in legislation directly from the basically the big 2009 stimulus was $1
The
trillion.
American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, the ARA.
But then there was another trillion. People forget about this. There was another trillion in stimulus bills gradually over the next 3 years that was actually mostly passed by a Republican Congress. And this is when you had the payroll tax holiday, the make work pay credit, unemployment benefit extensions that all the way went through 2013. There's kind of this view of, we under stimulus during the recession because we just did one bill. There was actually another trillion in additional stimulus that was signed by President Obama all the way through early 2013 that Republicans passed together. That was bipartisan. So when you're looking at the Obama numbers, there's about 2 trillion of it was stimulus policies recovering from the recession. And my reports break down every category. It breaks down every movement in the deficit by every category, including the parts we discussed earlier. That's the economy and technical re-estimates that are not related to legislation. You break out those two. And if you're a geek like me, it's really fun.
Yeah, no, I like it. I'm fascinated. I can't wait to read it. And Brian, one of the things, I guess, going along those lines for corrections and looking at CBO reports and everything, one of the things that I remember doing while I was at OMB was looking at the Trump tax cuts. And there was this discussion about the Trump tax cuts are going to pay for themselves and that sort of thing. And just to be upfront about it, I'm not a supply side economist that just says that tax cuts pay for themselves. I think you should also be reining in spending. If we're cutting taxes and the economy is growing faster, which I believe in incentive effects, right? Like there will be more revenue that's going to come in, then you don't need as much spending. You should be controlling the other side of the equation as well. And too often we don't do that. I mean, the last president that really did that was Calvin Coolidge 100 years ago. And when I go down that path, I saw from the Trump tax cuts, the situation is like, look, if we consider the economic effects and the statistical corrections that CBO did over time, from the deregulation and the tax cuts themselves and the new economic growth, there was an increase in revenue that the CBO announced over time that would have paid for the amounts of the static estimates from the tax cuts. I wonder if you had looked at anything like that or had any comments.
I mean, I haven't looked at the numbers recently. I did about a year ago. I mean, my reading is that they have not paid for themselves. My reading is that the problem is the challenge is disentangling everything else that's happened in the economy, especially when you have things like the pandemic in 2020. That wreaked havoc on tax revenues so much that it almost makes it impossible to measure the effect of the tax cuts at that point, because you're just analyzing a different economy and measuring. Even like right now, we've had a huge tax revenue increase in the past couple of years, and in fact, some of it's inflation, but some of it is also just coming out of the pandemic. Revenues this past year just hit 19.8% of GDP, which is only the second highest level since World War II. Individual income tax revenues hit 10.6% of GDP for the first time ever in the past year. Now the question is, how much of that is economic growth? How much of that is parts of the tax code that don't adjust for inflation fast enough? And so you get a short-term spike because part of the tax code is not adjusting for inflation yet. And so I think it's hard to disentangle all those effects from what was caused by the 2017 tax cuts. You have so many variables to control for. Yeah. I do remember that the Joint Tax Committee came out when the tax cuts were enacted. They said the static cost was about 1.5 trillion over 10 years. And they ballparked growth revenues are going to take care of about 350 billion of it. It did look like in the first couple of years, the economy did very well. You were there. 2019, the economy was roaring. It was on fire. It was far overperforming anything that had been projected. We created twice as many jobs between 2017 and 2019 as CBO projected when Trump took office. Yeah. So there was a higher feedback revenue effect from I think, than the 350 or $300 billion that were assumed by JCT. The challenge is, what do you do starting in 2020 when everything blew up in the economy? And at that point, I just don't know how to measure the Trump tax cuts anymore. I will say we would have had better economic effects if not for some of the other policies like the tariffs that kind of pulled back I think, some of our gains.
Yeah, and I would agree. I think even in some of our estimations when we were doing the economic assumptions for the budget and everything, that we would show that there was some lag, there was some negative economic effects, some negative shocks from those taxes. I think there was other arguments that it was still worth it to go after China internal within the Trump White House. I was pretty advocate of not doing that. I think that there should have been more pressure for free trade and trade agreements with friendly countries that I think would have put more pressure on China at the end of the day to liberalize. But my argument didn't win within those discussions.
Yeah, I mean, I get the national security arguments. I'm aware of hating China and cracking down on China is really good politics, and frankly, it's not without merit. I mean, I'm not a defender of China either.
Sure.
But I do come from the economic policy view that some of the policies like tariffs actually create more problems than they solve. I don't think it's a matter of being weak on China. I think you could say in a lot of places, tariffs do more damage to the United States than to the country we're trying to punish. And so I'm all for, I hold China in no regard. I'm not in favor of doing any favors for China.
Right.
But it's more, some of these policies just raise costs for American consumers.
Yeah.
They don't really change China's behavior as much as we would like. So I just don't know if they're effective.
No, that's a good point. I agree with you. And it's one of the things that I'm kind of concerned about is the direction of the future of where we're going, kind of wrapping things up here. There's kind of this conservative nationalism sort of movement, right? Where from those of us on the right is saying, look, we find that there are these problems that are out there. Government can be the solution if we just have the right people in power to make those corrections. Unfortunately, or at least in my default, Brian, is that government's usually the problem. And so if government's the problem, how can it be the solution? Because usually the government's just going to exacerbate the problem in the process, kind of to your point about the tariffs. I wonder do you have any concerns about some of that, or what have been your thoughts?
Absolutely. I think the economic nationalism comes from a good place in people's heart. When people say America's policy should put America first, I agree with that. Absolutely. I think the policies they promote, though, are really old democratic statist policies. They're big government. We're going to trust politicians to manage the economy better than we can manage. We're going to trust them to tax and spend and regulate in a way that will create better outcomes than if we trust ourselves and we trust free markets. And I just don't buy that. I think free markets have produced amazing prosperity in the United States. I think what some of the inequality data that gets thrown around is overblown because it's poor or misstated economic inequality data. A lot of it is misinterpreted. I think we have seen amazing prosperity. I think free trade has brought significant prosperity. And I think there is a role for government at the margins, of course, but the idea that if we go back to the old populist big government tax spending and regulating, but we just have it run by people we like, that we can trust them to do it better than the other people did. I've been in Washington 20 years. I don't trust any of these lawmakers. I know politicians. I've worked for politicians. I've advised politicians. I talk to members of Congress almost every day. They're wonderful people. I don't trust them to run the economy.
Yes. Well, and the market works best, right? Government is just other people, and their incentives are such that, they're in some sense, they have to be rent seekers because they have to be reelected in the process. So their marginal cost and marginal benefits are going to be much different than those of us that are in the private sector. Yeah.
I mean, remember, a government big enough to give you everything is a government big enough to take away. Yeah. And that's why I get really nervous when conservatives say, let's give government all these new tools over the economy, but don't worry because our guys are in charge and they'll use it for what we want. Well, our guys aren't going to be in charge forever. And if you're going to create all these new tools for regulators and politicians, what is going to happen with the first day the other guys are in charge? They are going to turn those weapons against you, and they're going to use them for economic destructive policies. And I think that it's just dangerous for us to go down that road. Yeah. And again, I do not agree with the critique that capitalism has failed. I think
Right.
American, we can talk all we want about how, we wish the economy was growing faster and we wish that we had more benefits. The poorest states in America are richer than many of the richest countries in Europe and elsewhere. So even the people who aren't doing well in America are doing a lot better than places that do not practice free market economics to the degree we do. And we can always do better, but so much of our problems are caused by government screw ups. Don't give them more power. Get rid of the entities making the screw ups. I think of things like the housing crash in 2008. That wasn't a failure of capitalism.
No.
That was the Federal Reserve kept interest rates too low.
Yep.
The Federal Reserve the federal government pumped up a housing boom. We did too much mortgage-backed securities. We had a lot of really poor regulations of the housing market that drove it more than just capitalism failed.
I agree. Amen. a lot of good points there. And in the last couple of minutes that we have here, if Brian, if you had a magic wand, and we know that it looks like this is November 16th, 2022. We just had an election. Looks like the Republicans will have the House. Control of the House. Senate still up for grabs. We don't know yet after Georgia. But if Brian was given the wand and said, "Hey, look, this is the policies that we need to have for a pro-growth, more prosperous America," what would you put in place?
Oh boy, the first thing I would do is address the spending. Because if we don't fix spending, we are going to have to raise taxes, and people need to understand this. If we don't address the spending trends, we are going to have to nearly double your income taxes at a certain point just to pay for the current policies we have. Once you surrender that, once you start putting in a doubling of tax rates, huge value-added tax, payroll tax, you can't do much of anything else to help the economy. You're going to have stagnation. And so I think one of the first things I would do is I would address Social Security and Medicare, and I would do it sooner rather than later, because the sooner you do it, the more gradual it's going to be. You don't have to pummel current seniors as nearly to a destructive degree if you do it soon. I would also, I think, I'd do a lot more to address government red tape and regulation. Even under good presidents, the amount of red tape and regulation just gets worse and worse and worse. And we need to have some sort of rule. The Trump administration was good on this, that, if you're going to add a regulation, you got to get rid of a regulation. Those kinds of rules, I think we have to fix that. And then things like unleash American energy, bring more of a free market to the healthcare system, bring more consumer choice to the healthcare system. I think bring more free trade. Those things can help us prosper more.
Yeah, I totally agree. One of the big things that I'm in favor of, Brian, is like a spending limit. I love for us to have a spending limit at the federal level. I mean, you look at all the states, and I've done a lot of work with different states of them trying to improve their spending limits, but we call the conservative Texas budget or responsible budgets that are out there based on population growth and inflation, but just something that helps to rein in all the discretion that's going on because it makes it very difficult otherwise. I mean, at the federal level, you don't have a balanced budget amendment like you have in 49 of the 50 states.
And in Europe, Europe has fiscal limits more than the United States does.
Exactly right. And I think that would also help rein in our deficits, which would also help rein in the Federal Reserve. If the Federal Reserve didn't have so much debt that they could buy from the Treasury, then that would limit their ability to manipulate the economy like they do.
Absolutely. I think fiscal limits are important. I mean, last year, the federal government spent $47,000 per household. I tell audiences, raise your hand if you're getting your money's worth. Yeah, I mean, the idea that we can spend our way out of our problems, we're already spending $47,000 per household. If you just let people keep more of that money for themselves, think of the problems you could solve. Yeah. And so spending limits, I think, are a key component. But once my only concern with spending limits is some conservatives talk about spending limits as if it's the end of the story rather than the beginning. It's okay, right. But once you get the spending limits, what are you going to cut to get there? What are you going to reform to get there? And we have to have that discussion that we have promised so much more spending than we've actually can afford and that we think we're going to pay in taxes. We got to get under control.
Well, I totally agree. Any last words before we part.
You're in Texas. Congrats to Texas on having a good election night, a very good election night. It looks like Texas, Florida, other states are kind of showing the way for the future. And so just wanted to compliment your people.
Well, I hope so. I hope that's the case. We need more of that. And we need more people like you, Brian, working on the budget and finding ways that will help roll back the oversized government, the national debt, and everything else that's really taken away from us being able to flourish. Because otherwise, we need to prosper, And so, again, thank you, Brian, for being on the Let People Prosper show. Thank you, the audience, for listening today and watching. If you're watching on YouTube, you can find the show notes page at vanceginn.substack.com. Thank you again. Let People Prosper.